You are not a quiet person by nature. You became quiet by necessity, by repetition, by years of learning that speaking up cost more than staying still. Right now, somewhere underneath the composed surface you present to colleagues, to family, to anyone watching, there is a level of internal noise that almost no one around you would guess exists. You function well. You deliver. You show up. You handle what needs handling. The people around you likely see someone steady, maybe even someone they rely on as the stable one. And that image is not entirely false, but it is also not the whole picture. The whole picture includes things you have not said out loud in years, possibly decades. This is not a personal failure. This is not a quirk of your particular temperament. This is not something you could have prevented by making different choices at some earlier point in your life. This is a learned behavioral architecture, built carefully, built early, and reinforced so many thousands of times that it now operates below the level of conscious decision. The name for what you carry is structured silence, and it did not come from nowhere. Generation X, broadly speaking, contains the men born between 1965 and 1980, the cohort that came of age in a window of history unlike anything before or after it. You inherited a world mid-transformation. The industrial model of manhood, stoic provider, minimal emotional vocabulary, strength measured by endurance, was still fully intact when you were young enough to absorb it as fact rather than choice. Your fathers, your uncles, the men visible to you in childhood, operated under that model without apparent irony. Silence was not described as a coping mechanism, it was described as maturity. At the same time, the cultural architecture around you was beginning to crack. Divorce rates climbed steadily throughout your formative years, reshaping what households looked like and what was expected of young men inside them. Many of you became responsible earlier than you should have, not because anyone asked, but because the situation required it and you were present. You learned to read rooms. You learned to manage emotional climates without drawing attention to the fact that you were doing it. The economy you entered as young adults was already beginning the long contraction of the middle. The implicit deal, work hard, stay loyal, build a stable life, was dissolving in real time. Corporate restructuring, layoffs, the replacement of secure employment with contingent employment, these were not abstract news events. They were things that happened to people near you. You adjusted your expectations downward and kept moving. The technology shift that followed rewired communication itself. The rise of digital culture happened fast enough that you adapted to it without fully being shaped by it. You learned the new language as adults, but your emotional wiring was formed in the pre-digital world. You can operate in both registers, but something about the speed and exposure of contemporary communication has always felt slightly foreign to the person you actually are on the inside. None of this produced a single clean psychological outcome. What it produced was a layered set of adaptations, each one reasonable given its context, each one contributing to a cumulative internal weight that most men your age have never had the language or occasion to name. What follows is not a list of problems. It is a map of 5 psychological layers that operate simultaneously in most Gen X men. Layers built over time, reinforced by repetition, and rarely examined because examining them was never part of the original instruction set. The 5 layers are the competence mask, the role performance that became indistinguishable from identity, the cost calculation, the unconscious arithmetic that runs before every expression of need, the relational withdrawal, the slow, strategic retreat from genuine emotional proximity, the meaning erosion, the quiet dissolution of a narrative that once made the effort feel worthwhile, the unnamed grief, the layer almost no one talks about, not because it is too painful, but because it has never been given a name. Each layer is distinct. Each layer feeds the others. Together, they form something that functions less like a mood and more like a permanent weather pattern, and you have been living inside it for so long that you may have stopped noticing it is there. Layer 1. The Competence Mask. The most visible layer is the one you wear most fluently. You are the person who knows how things work. You can fix what is broken, navigate what is complicated, manage what is uncertain. In professional contexts, in family contexts, in any context where a problem needs solving, you are the one people look toward. And you deliver, consistently, without much visible effort. What is not visible is the amount of energy required to maintain that appearance of effortlessness.
The competence mask was not designed as a mask. It began as a genuine capacity. You were good at things, you were reliable, people noticed, and the feedback loop reinforced itself. But at some point, difficult to pinpoint exactly, the capacity became a role, and the role became a wall. Being competent meant being asked. Being asked meant being needed. Being needed meant you had a function, and having a function felt, for a long time, close enough to having a place. The psychological cost accumulated slowly. Every time you solved something without voicing the difficulty, the internal inventory of unvoiced difficulty grew. Every time you were the stable one in a situation that was also affecting you, the gap between your internal experience and your external presentation widened. Not dramatically, never dramatically, because drama was not part of the architecture. Just incrementally, invisibly, the way water moves through stone. The result is a man who is genuinely competent and genuinely exhausted by the performance of competence, but who has no available mechanism for separating the two. Competence is not the problem. The fusion of competence with identity is the problem, and it happened so gradually that most Gen X men cannot locate the moment it occurred. Layer 2. The cost calculation. Beneath the performance runs a constant, mostly unconscious arithmetic. Before you say something vulnerable, before you ask for help, before you admit to something difficult, you run a calculation. The calculation is fast, faster than thought really, more like a reflex. It assesses probability of misunderstanding, risk of appearing weak, likelihood that the disclosure will change how the other person sees you in a way that is hard to reverse, and whether the relief of expression is worth the exposure. The calculation almost always concludes, not worth it. This is not pessimism. This is pattern recognition, built from real data accumulated over decades. You tried at some earlier point, maybe more than once. You said something honest about how you were doing, or what you needed, or what you were struggling with, and the response was somewhere on a spectrum from awkward silence to active dismissal, to a kind of gentle redirection that made clear the other person did not know what to do with what you had just offered. You learned, not from one experience, but from the slow accumulation of experiences that produced a consistent result. The cost calculation is not irrational. It was calibrated against reality. The problem is that it cannot distinguish between the relationships where expression is genuinely risky and the relationships where it might not be. It runs the same algorithm in all situations because efficiency is the point, and the algorithm was designed for a world that no longer exists, or that no longer exists in the same form, or that you would like to believe no longer exists but cannot yet verify. Meanwhile, the things that do not get said do not disappear. They become internal monologue. They become the running commentary that accompanies everything else you do. The second layer of awareness behind whatever you are currently doing that consists entirely of things you have not found the right moment, the right relationship, or the right permission to say. Layer 3. The Relational Withdrawal. Over time, the cost calculation produces a structural change in how you relate to other people. You are not unfriendly. You are not cold in the way that reads as visible distance. You can be warm, engaging, even funny. People like being around you, but there is a level of proximity you do not allow, a depth of access you do not grant, and most of the people in your life have no idea it is there because you have never announced it, and you have become skilled at creating the impression of openness without actually opening. This began as protection. After enough experiences of emotional disclosure landing badly, not catastrophically, just badly, you recalibrated. You kept the social presence, you withdrew the interior. What this produces over years and decades is a particular kind of loneliness that is difficult to name because you are technically surrounded by people. You have relationships, you have friendships, some of them long-standing. You have a partner, possibly, or have had one. You are not isolated in any external measurable sense, but you are largely alone with the version of yourself that contains your actual interior experience, because that version has not been introduced to most of the people around you. The relational withdrawal is not a decision you made once. It is a practice you have maintained consistently enough that it has become your default operating mode. And the longer it runs, the harder it becomes to imagine the alternative, not because the alternative is not available, but because the gap between where you are and where you would need to be to bridge it feels, most days, too large to cross in any practical way. Layer 4. The Meaning Erosion. At some point in the last several years, possibly longer, the story that made the effort feel purposeful began to lose coherence. You spent a significant portion of your adult life building something.
A career, a family, a reputation, a particular kind of life. You made sacrifices that you did not fully register as sacrifices at the time because you were moving forward, and moving forward felt like progress, and progress felt like it was pointing somewhere. And then, at a point that is hard to identify precisely, the pointing stopped. Not the effort. The effort continued. You were still doing most of the things you were doing before, but the internal relationship to those things changed. The narrative that organized them, that framed the daily work as part of a larger arc, that gave the sacrifices a future payoff, that made the grinding manageable by connecting it to something that mattered, that narrative became harder to access. This is not a midlife crisis in the popular cultural sense. It is quieter than that and more pervasive. It does not produce dramatic behavior. It produces a kind of low-level flatness, a persistent sense that you are executing tasks rather than living a life, that the motion is real, but the meaning underneath it has thinned. For Gen X men specifically, this erosion carries an additional layer of complexity. The cultural models you inherited told you that meaning would come from provision and from endurance. You provided, you endured, and the meaning did not arrive in the form the models promised. What arrived instead was competence without fulfillment, and responsibility without recognition, and a growing private question that you have almost never voiced because voicing it felt like ingratitude or weakness or both. The question is not whether your life is good. By many measures, it is. The question is whether the person living it is still fully present inside it, or whether some essential part of him checked out several years ago and has been running on autopilot since. Layer 5. The Unnamed Grief. This is the layer that sits underneath everything else, and it is the one that gets spoken about least. Not because it is the most painful, though it may be, but because it has never been given adequate language in the cultural vocabulary available to men your age. You have lost things, not all of them in ways that are socially legible as loss. Some of the losses were large and visible, deaths, endings, failures that had names and dates. But the losses that accumulate most heavily are the ones that were never formally recognized as losses. The version of yourself that existed before the adaptations began. The relationships that could have gone deeper but didn't. The things you wanted and did not pursue because the window closed, or the moment passed, or you calculated that wanting them was not worth the exposure. The years in which you were functioning at full capacity but experiencing almost nothing. Grief, in the traditional sense, has a structure. There is a cause, a period of mourning, an eventual integration. What you carry is not that kind of grief. It is diffuse, ambient, largely unwitnessed. It does not have a clear object. It is more like the accumulated residue of a life spent performing adequacy while something more specific, more personal, more fully yours went consistently unacknowledged. The silence you learned was not only the silence of not speaking, it was also the silence of not grieving, of moving through losses without ceremonies, without witnesses, without the permission to stay with what was gone before being required to continue forward. This layer does not announce itself clearly. It shows up as a persistent sense of something missing, as a disproportionate response to small endings, as a kind of tiredness that sleep does not touch, as the particular quality of stillness that descends when you are alone and the performance is finally, briefly off. What you are carrying is not depression, though it has some of its texture. It is not a crisis, though it has some of its weight. It is not a character flaw, a weakness, a failure to be adequately grateful for what you have. What you are carrying is the fully predictable outcome of a particular set of instructions, received early, reinforced consistently, and applied by a person who is doing the most reasonable thing available to him at every stage of the process. The competence mask, and the cost calculation, and the relational withdrawal, and the meaning erosion, and the unnamed grief do not exist in sequence. They exist in parallel, continuously, simultaneously, each one feeding and reinforcing the others in a system that has been running long enough that it has become invisible through familiarity. You are not broken. You are operating exactly as you were built to operate. And that, for most Gen X men, is the heaviest part of all of this. Not that something went wrong, but that everything went precisely according to plan. Thank you for staying with this. If what you encountered here felt familiar in ways that are still moving through you, there is a connected piece that goes further into one specific dimension of what was named here. The question of what it costs over a lifetime to be the stable one in every room you enter. The link is below. It is not a solution. It is a continuation of the same line of thinking. That is all for this one. If it landed somewhere real for you, the like button is a quiet way of acknowledging that without having to say anything, which feels appropriate given the subject matter. You know that Gen X thing where you have felt something deeply but you'd rather die to admit it out loud in public? Drop that in the comments. You are not alone in that particular habit. And if you want more of this kind of thinking delivered without algorithm interference, the subscribe button is there. The bell is optional. You already know how to manage your own notifications.